mysterious explosions at Iran's strategic port. Iran continues to laugh at the United States, and Trump promises that Iran's Revolutionary Guards will soon be no longer laughing at all. Iran responded with a contemptuous proposal to the United States offer, and it turns out that Iran's Revolutionary Guards are not currently willing to deal with the nuclear issue. The latest signs on the ground show that something is happening inside the Revolutionary Guards. This is just when it seems impossible to escalate the situation any further. Elements within the Revolutionary Guards did the same thing, escalated more than before. Trump, in response, said that we destroyed 70% of the targets inside Iran. It will take them years to recover. They won't laugh any longer. It seems that Trump is furious, and an urgent call with Prime Minister Netanyahu has been scheduled. And on the other side, in Iran, Mustafa Khamenei is projecting strength to the Iranian army. The phase of restraint by the Revolutionary Guards is over. The supreme leader of the Revolutionary Guards published this to the Iranian nation. And against the backdrop of the crisis in the talks and the American blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, senior officials in Tehran are threatening a harsh response against the American vessels and against the bases. The distress of the regime in Tehran, militias from Iraq were brought into Iran to suppress the citizens. Iran carried out another launch towards the United Arab Emirates, and they received a resounding slap in the face because the United Arab Emirates chose a different, clear side in this war. And $10 trillion a day is at risk. Tehran is targeting the internet cables in the Strait of Hormuz. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Iran is threatening the internet. So, are the underwater cables in the Strait of Hormuz in danger? Iran's Revolutionary Guards will collect usage fees between Washington and Tehran. Qatar is in the middle. And what are the Qataris demanding as mediators in these negotiations? After the suspension of the American Freedom Project in the Strait of Hormuz, this was received in Tehran as a strategic victory that had been expected in advance. Newspaper front pages in Iran already presented an image of absolute superiority and humiliation of the United States and its allies, including Israel. And now, the question is, what is happening in reality? And what is the truth? So I'm Yair Pinto with Ms. Mati Shoshani, and we are boots on the ground coming to you from Israel with everything that's happening, bringing you the truth from our neighborhood, from this region. And in an initial report from Iran, a powerful explosion was heard today in the city of Chabahar in the southeast of the country. The sound of blast caused panic amongst the residents and led to high alert amongst the local security forces. At this stage, there is no official confirmation of the casualties or significant damage, and the authorities are avoiding giving details about the circumstances of this incident. The event is taking place in one of the most sensitive areas for Iran, and we will bring you all the details very soon. Because the naval blockade imposed by the United States in the Strait of Hormuz is putting the Iranian regime under unprecedented pressure. And 1 month after it began, it appears that the consequences are far more severe than has been reported so far. After reports of salary freezes and the use of old tankers to store oil, new information that arrived today, on Sunday, revealed the depth of the despair in Tehran. The Iranians have begun using a fleet of old oil tankers, ones that have not been used for decades. The regime is well aware of the severe maintenance problems of the tankers and of the fact that they are not properly sealed. But despite this, they continue to pump massive quantities of crude oil into them, causing widespread leaks and pollution into the sea. The deep crisis is also creeping into the system itself, and the understanding of the severity of the situation is beginning to spread. And according to sources, senior officials in Iran oil systems who understand the crisis personally is more severe than they initially thought. They are examining escape routes and are looking for a way to leave Iran before the economic collapse is even worsened. But above the surface, it currently seems that Donald Trump is waiting for an agreement, and in Iran, they are waiting for the launch of order because the Revolutionary Guards threatened to attack the American targets if Iranian tankers were hit. And at the same time, Trump is waiting for Tehran's response to the permanent ceasefire agreement. In Iran, they has finally responded to the American proposal for the negotiations. And Iran's proposal was submitted to the United States 2 days later, and in practice, it contains nothing new, only a continuation of the Revolutionary Guard's contempt towards the United States of America. Some of the details of the proposal include a ceasefire for another 30 days, the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, and negotiations about the future. Last Friday, the United States was supposed to receive Iran's answers, but it was not receiving them until this afternoon. And now, it turns out that Iran's proposal submitted through Pakistan is nothing less than humiliating to Trump and to the United States. Iran's president issued his first message moments after it was reported that the response to the American proposal had been submitted. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian referred to the continuation of the contacts and claims, "We will never surrender to the enemy. The goal is to guarantee the rights of the Iranian people." Trump extended the deadline again until Wednesday, and Tehran said today that it had transferred its response to the Pakistani mediator and not to the Qataris. Mujtaba Khamenei met with the head of the Iranian Strategic Command, and Khamenei, he gave instructions to Iran's army on how to continue operations against the American blockade. Washington is waiting for the details, and Israel is monitoring the issue of enriched uranium and the continuation of the fighting in the Gulf. So look, as the tension around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz continues to escalate, and against the backdrop of the crisis in the talks with the United States and the growing pressure on Tehran, sharp threats were heard today from senior Iranian officials, and the spokesman for the National Security Committee in the Iranian parliament, Ibrahim Ghazai, declared that from Iran's point of view, the phase of restraint has ended, and warned that any harm to Iranian vessels would be met with a harsh response. The commander of the Iranian Navy reveals a dramatic expansion of the underwater array in the Strait of Hormuz, with covert capacities and also strike vessels and direct threats against the countries that are cooperating with the American sanctions. According to him, any harm to our vessels will be met with a heavy and decisive Iranian response against the American vessels and against their bases. Ghazai added that the clock is ticking and not in favor of the Americans, and called on the United States not to deepen its involvement in the confrontation. And hours after the Iranian threat, a ship was attacked near Qatar. A vessel was hit this morning near the coast of Qatar after Iran's threats against the American ships in the Gulf, and at the same time, Tehran is warning countries that to join the sanctions will have a severe implications. Okay, this will have difficulty passing through the Strait of Hormuz. And Donald Trump already raised yesterday before reporters the possibility that the United States would return to Freedom Project Plus, meaning in addition to other things which he avoided dealing in the former operation, Freedom Project, the U.S. asked Qatar to return and mediate between it and Iran, even though Qatar was attacked by the Iranians with missiles and drones in the early days of this war. And this came after the Pakistani delegation failed to bring an answer from the Iranians to the proposed offer for negotiations from the U.S. So officially, Pakistan continues to mediate, but the Qataris are working intensely with Iran behind the scenes to end this conflict. So Qatar's Prime Minister Mohammed al-Thani held a visit in Washington this past weekend and met for about 2 hours with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who heads the American negotiation teams. From there, he continued and also met with the Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Miami, and the American envoy Steve Witkoff also participated in the meeting. The Revolutionary Guards announced that on yesterday their intention to impose usage fees on the underwater internet cables in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran is trying to impose Iranian sovereignty over the infrastructure that until now has enjoyed immunity under the international maritime law. They are threatening that failure to pay would lead to sabotage of these cables. Escalation in the Gulf is taking place also. The United Arab Emirates reported the interception of drones that are launched from Iran hours after Tehran declared the end of the phase of restraint and threatened a heavy response against the American targets in the region. Iran is attacking the United Arab Emirates because of its ties with Israel and with the United States, but in Abu Dhabi, they are responding by strengthening the alliance. And according to the reports, Israel even developed Iron Dome in the country, and this is following the Iranian attacks. And inside Iran, militias from Iraq were brought into Iran to suppress the citizens themselves. The Revolutionary Guards and the local security forces suffered heavy losses in the latest war, and the regime was forced to import mercenaries from Iraq and Afghanistan in order to control the streets. Residents in Tehran are reporting severe violence. It feels like an occupation. They don't understand Persian and behave with much greater brutality than the local forces do. And against the backdrop of the war against the Revolutionary Guards in Iran in the Middle East, Trump will land this week in Beijing for his first visit to China since 2017. China was indeed harmed by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but it had prepared itself for this scenario for years. What are the goals, the dangers, and the needs between China and the United States? We will dive into all the details very soon. So let's begin. I'm Yair Pinto, with me is Mati Shoshani, and we are boots on the ground bringing you the whole truth about what's happening in Israel and in the Middle East in this war against the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. And 1 second before we begin, I want to call on you to continue spreading the truth. Share our content with as many people as possible. Click the subscribe button. And most importantly, do not forget to look for me, Yair Pinto, and Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms in order to get a view through our eyes of what it's like to live in Israel under this war. So, our senior Middle East correspondent, Mati Shoshani, do the explosion in Chabahar and the crisis with the oil tankers indicate that Iran is beginning to truly suffocate from this blockade, not only economically, but also with their infrastructure?
Yeah, I think it's becoming clearly evident that the Iranians are suffering financially in a very dramatic way. They've lost a lot of revenue, and they're starting to face an almost existential threat of loss of future revenue from what's happening with their oil. Now, again, we need to continuously remind people that oil is not an on and off switch. When you're producing oil and you have wells working around the clock, you can't just shut them off. When you'll want to restart them, it'll cost a lot, it might take time, and it even might lead to well collapse. So it's a complicated, very, very technical field in which there's a lot that needs to be done to be able to change the situation. So what are the Iranians doing? We're seeing a couple of really interesting things. The first one is we're seeing the fact that they're using old tankers to store their oil. Why are they doing that? Well, typically, on any given day, they pull the oil out of the wells, run it through pipes to Hog Island or other locations, stored in these big silos, these ubiquitous round silos, keep the oil in there. And when the ships come to carry the oil, they carry that oil out to the ships. But now they've run out of space. They've run out of space in the ships. They've run out of space in the silos. They've run out of space even in their secondary storage facilities. And what they're doing is they're using these old, semi-broken, possibly leaking oil tankers to hold the oil off the shores of Iran. Now, this problem is becoming even more problematic, or more of a huge issue, by the fact that the American armed forces are now bombing those same ships. How do we know this? Well, I can show you the images right here on my phone. We have satellite imagery that shows multiple oil tankers parked close to the shorelines of Iran with oil leaking from them or fires coming out of the engine bays of those ships. Why? because the Iranians continue to do the same thing they've done before, try to circumvent the naval blockade, and at the same time try to store oil so they're not running out of storage space for that oil. We've even seen images, which are still debatable over what's actually happening, of oil flowing into the ocean out of facilities in the Persian Gulf. Was that a result of a technical malfunction, or the Iranian regime simply pumping oil into the sea to keep the wells going? We're not entirely sure right now. But what we do know is that this blockade is causing substantial financial damage on the Iranian regime. We know it's hurting them. We know they're scrambling in every possible direction to try and make up for lost money, to try and harm the oil trade for other countries, and to make sure that they have the storage facilities for their oil. Here and there, we also see the Iranian regime try to circumvent, to get by the American blockade on their shores and get oil out from Iran to their clients around the world. Now remember, this is a very tenuous, a very delicate relationship. If the Iranians have been supplying the Chinese with discount cost oil for a very long time now, those clients might not be there to buy from the Iranians again if the war prevents them from selling over an extended period of time. They'll find another supplier at another cost that has the ability to, in a more sustainable way, deliver oil over time. So this is both a short-term problem for the Iranians and a long-term problem for the Iranians. Is this a sign that the Iranian regime is falling, is breaking? We don't know that. Is this a sign that they're about to become bankrupt or insolvent financially? I don't think so, but it doesn't mean that they're not feeling the pressure, that they're not feeling the heat, that they're not feeling the pain of this ongoing naval blockade on them. Of course, that's made much worse by the fact that they're also running out of storage space for their oil. So not collapsing yet, but yes, the financial gain here is substantial, is meaningful for the Iranians, and there is no apparent solution in the immediate future.
Mati, when Iran is now threatening not only ships but also underwater internet cables, is the war in the Gulf moving into a new phase of attacking global civilian infrastructure?
I think what we're experiencing right now is a very interesting change in the global economy and the global economy of war. Let me explain that. There's a couple things happening here at the same time. One, many countries, and Iran is not the only one of them, I'll get to that in a second, have realized that סמא, אנחנו בטוחים שהמיקרופון שלי מחובר? אני לא יכול פשוט לראות את המסך.
כן. זה בסדר.
סבבה. סליחה, פשוט לא ראיתי את הבר הזה על המסך.
כן. זה בסדר. תתחיל שוב.
Okay. This is question 2 again. I think what we're witnessing here is a transformation of the way war is waged around the world. And this is not only happening in Iran, it's also happening elsewhere in the world. So the Iranians are saying, look, we're not only going to stop oil from traveling through the Strait of Hormuz, in fact, we're going to go farther than that. We're going to come after you. And what we're going to do is we're going to rip up the internet cables from the bottom of the sea. As most of you might know, the way internet works is essentially large pipelines of fiber optics that connect servers throughout the world. Well, those run also through the Strait of Hormuz, and they're threatening to rip them up unless companies and countries pay them essentially blackmail money to prevent them from ripping up that infrastructure. But it goes even farther than that when you really think about the logistics of this. They're saying any food that goes through, any oil that goes through, even access to internet, we're going to start taxing it. Now, they didn't make this up on their own. Guess who also is doing this? The Russians are doing this, allegedly, let me say it that way, in the North Sea. They've several times used fishing ships or other logistical ships who drop their anchor somewhere deep in the sea, drag it along, and suddenly, bang, a country doesn't have internet and they have to rerun the cables to that country. This hasn't happened once, and it hasn't happened twice. And countries around the world are waking up to a reality that is called asymmetrical warfare. And asymmetrical warfare can take advantage of the vulnerability of the global economy. The world we live in, me in Israel, you wherever you are in the world, I assume since you're watching this on the internet that you're in a first world country or something close to that. What we're experiencing around the world is a very, very complex network of trade and communication and regulations that allow me to buy in the store in Israel food that was grown elsewhere in the world, to connect right now to the internet and ping a server wherever it is in the world, all that technology, all that network of relationships, of communication, that can be severed. And it's not that complicated to sever it. And the Iranians are right now threatening to do that to other countries. They're saying, look, if you're going to bring us back to the Stone Age, as the US is starting to do to us, if you're going to take us back to a place where suddenly life becomes very complicated, very expensive, very unpleasant for us in Iran, well, how about we do the same to you? How are you going to like it when you don't have internet? How are you going to like it when you try to have a ship that brings through food from wherever in Asia and we just blow a hole in that side, the side of that ship, or just make the engine stop working and suddenly you have no bananas or no apples or no flour or no oil or no, you name whatever the commodity is. And they're pointing out here a real vulnerability that exists in global trade. And I think as this progresses, it's going to become more and more apparent to people around the world how vulnerable the global economy is and how strongly you have to fight against disruptors and terrorist entities like the Iranian regime to prevent them from ruining the life that we get to live. There's one last lesson here, which is every country around the world is going to walk out of this conflict and crisis with a clear understanding. I should be more autonomous. I need to have redundancy to my trade and export routes and, of course, my import routes. And I need to make sure that I am more self-reliant, more of an island economy when it comes to food manufacturing and other essential elements of my economy, be it steel, its manufacturing, or its extraction from the earth, be it things that are needed for feeding the population or even for water supply. This war highlights the vulnerability of a global economy and, of course, highlights the need to protect oneself from it. And again, it also shows that when you're dealing with a country such as the Iranian Ayatollah regime, who's willing to kill its own people and anyone else in the world to promote its agenda and sustain the evil regime that it is, well, there's a lot that they're willing to do that can severely harm others. And unless you're willing to use that same weapon against them, which we, generally speaking, are not willing to do, well, then you're always going to be at the mercy of someone who's willing to cut off the branch that both you and them are sitting on. That's the reality of dealing with a terrorist regime like the Iranians. That is the reality of dealing with a country that uses asymmetrical terrorist nature warfare against others around the world.
Mati, does the move from Pakistani mediation to Qatari mediation just before Trump's visit to China shows that the crisis with Iran is already bigger than the negotiation themselves?
Okay, this is a really good question, Yair, and I want to go back to sort of the background information of everything that's happening here. In the past, many different countries have been the middle country or the mediators between the United States and the Iranians. This last time, it was the Pakistanis in Islamabad who were mediating. And again, I need to remind people that these countries volunteer to mediate not simply because they love peace, freedom, and global trade. They have a vested interest in this. They themselves want to be on the good side of the Iranians. They want to get something out of it, be it prestige, be it power, be it finances. They have something in the game. They have skin in the game of mediating. We're hearing now that the Qataris too want to be back in the seat of the mediators in this. But in reality, I want to remind all of us that there is no real substantial negotiation that's taking place. What we've been witnessing in recent days is essentially a big game, a game of pretend in connecting the United States and Iran, who are both, I mean, one is over here and another one is over here. This is not one specific country. And, it's just like they're saying one thing, they're saying another. There's almost no connection between what they're saying. And we need to take it as such. There is no interest right now in the United States or in Iran in actually going through with the ceasefire agreement. There's no real interest right now in Iran or in the United States in going back to full-scale military operations right now. They're both in the sweet spot as far as the conflict is concerned. It doesn't mean it's going to change. It means that when the interests align, the negotiations will change. This also highlights something else. The whole picture here is far greater than just the US and Iran. This is a global scale conflict. Behind the US is a whole line of Western countries that have lived in the patronage of the United States for decades, relying on it for trade, for securing travel routes, for fighting their war, for policing the regions that they live in, and for maintaining peace on a global scale. These countries are realizing of what happens when you no longer have the patronage or the protection of the United States, or when someone's trying to break that hegemony, that piece of the United States. But also on the Iranian side, there are people playing. You have the Chinese behind the Iranians. You have the Russians behind the Iranians, and these countries are relying on the fact that they can use Iran to be a stick in the wheel of the United States and the global economy, something that they can use to harm, to hurt, to bring out the worst of this situation for other countries because it plays in their benefit. That is the reason they're doing this. This is the agenda that they're promoting. One thing to note here is that President Trump is supposed to meet the Chinese President Xi Jinping sometime in the very near future. And they're going to meet because this whole thing that's happening is related not only to the United States and Iran, as I said, but also to the greater conflict, which is the battle of the empires, the Chinese versus the Americans. Who is stronger? Who is more resilient financially? Who can play the geopolitics, the trade, the commodity game to a greater degree? Right now, the US has the upper hand on many different levels, but we'll see where things go in the days and months to come.
Thank you very much, Mati Shoshani. That really helped me better understand the situation that we are dealing with. So to all of you, back at home, continue spreading the truth. Share our content with as many people as possible. Click on the subscribe button and look for me, Yair Pinto, and for Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms. Many Israelis are still juggling reserve duty while trying to get back to work and handle their day-to-day lives. It's not easy. Your body is tired. Your mind is overloaded. And the pressure doesn't stop when the uniform comes off. I've been there, coming home from reserves, trying to be present for my children, catching up at work, while still feeling like I'm in a survival mode. It takes strength, energy, and faith to push through. That's why I started using Vinya. It's an Israeli supplement made from red grape cells that helps improve the blood flow to your heart, brain, and muscles. For me, that meant better focus, more energy, and fewer days of that foggy, burnt out feeling. So I started using it during my reserve duty, and I'm still taking it today. I also like the coffee version in the mornings, and also there is the tea versions, but either way, it works. So if you want to try it for yourself, go to vinyatbnisrael.com or call 800-638-1944. Again, 800-638-1944. So faith really helped me throughout this war, and Vinya helped me physically to stay sharp. Let's get back to the news. A cargo ship was attacked in Qatar's territorial waters. This is northeast of the port of Masayid, and this is according to the Qatari reports. A drone hit the vessel, which had arrived from Abu Dhabi, caused a limited fire, and there were no casualties in that incident. Almost at the same time, the United Arab Emirates reported intercepting 2 drones that were launched from Iran. So the question now is very sharp. Is this still a ceasefire, or is this already the next round of trying to hide behind diplomatic talks? I'm Yair Pinto, and this is your Boots on the Ground report. Today, I'm coming to you from the top of the mountain of Masada, next to the Dead Sea, which is behind me in the middle of the desert. And we go into the war between Israel and Iran, of course, together with the United States of America. And this is a big war between the Revolutionary Guards and all of the regional systems that Tehran has built over decades in order to combat us in this day with their proxies, with the terrorists. So, because while Washington is talking about a proposal to end this war, Tehran is sending a completely different message. It is sending an answer through Pakistan, but at the same time, threatening the American bases, the ships, the Gulf states, and even the underwater internet cables in the Strait of Hormuz. This is the picture tonight. Talks for an agreement on one side and a military test of power on the other side. And the heart of the whole story is located at one choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. For more than 2 months, the Strait of Hormuz has turned from an international passageway into a war zone. Hundreds of ships are stuck in the Persian Gulf. Around 20,000 sailors are waiting for permission to leave. Some of them have been inside the threat for more than 65 days. They're not soldiers. They're not part of the war, but they have become a tool of pressure. More than 30 ships have been hit since the beginning of this escalation by the Iranian missiles and drones, and at least 10 sailors have been killed. Crews are reporting shortages of food, water, fuel, and medicine. The Iranian message is clear. If the world puts pressure on Iran, Iran will put pressure on the world through the sea. The United States tried to break this blockade. Project Freedom. The plan was to restore the movement of the commercial ships through the strait under American military escort, and according to the reports, the force included guided missiles, destroyers, aircrafts, unmanned platforms, and large forces in the area. But the operation was stopped after only 36 hours. Immediately after it came an exchange of fire. Iran opened fire at the American destroyers that are passing through the strait. The American military responded with strikes against the Iranian targets. Trump said that the ceasefire was still in effect. The Iranians claimed that Washington was the one that violated it. And there begins the absurdity of the Middle East and what's happening here. There is a ceasefire, but there is fire. There are talks, but there are threats. There is diplomacy, but ships are still burning. The spokesman for the National Security Committee in the Iranian parliament, Ibrahim Razai, said that the phase of restraint has ended. He threatened that any strike on an Iranian vessel would be answered with a heavy response against the American ships and bases. He also addressed the clock is ticking and not in the American favor. The spokesman of Iran's army went even further, and he warned that countries that cooperate with the American sanctions will face difficulties passing through Hormuz. He spoke about new weapons, new methods of warfare, and new arenas. In other words, Iran is not threatening only the United States. It is threatening anyone who decides to cooperate with the economic campaign. And it does not end with ships, because the Revolutionary Guards are already talking about the underwater internet cables that pass through the Hormuz area. These are cables that connect financial systems, trade, cloud services, communications, and international payments. And in Iran, voices are calling to charge Western companies usage fees for this underwater passage. The numbers here are enormous. The global financial communication systems connects more than 11,000 banks and financial institutions in more than 200 countries. And according to reports, data and transactions of massive value pass through these infrastructures every single day. This is no longer only oil. This is the lifeline of the modern economy, and Iran understands this very well. It is trying to turn Hormuz from only a maritime passage into a pressure tool over energy, trade, banking, and communications. And at the same time, the commander of the Iranian Navy presented an expansion of the underwater system in the strait. These are light submarines called in Iran the Dolphin of the Persian Gulf. According to Iranian statements, they can stay for a long time in the seabed. They can track the movements of the vessels and they can strike them when necessary. So, we need to understand the operational importance. The Strait of Hormuz is crowded. It's sensitive area, filled with maritime traffic. A small and quiet submarine in an area like that can create serious challenge for the Western navies. You do not always need a large force to create a large problem. Sometimes a small tool, hard to detect, in the right place is enough. And still, while all of this is happening on the ground, diplomacy continues to work. Iran sent its answer to the American proposal. This was sent to Pakistan, and according to reports, the answer focused first on ending the war, securing maritime traffic, and removing the blockade around Hormuz. Some reports speak about an attempt to reach a short-term agreement of 30 days, extending the ceasefire and opening the strait, and then continuing the negotiations towards a broader agreement. That's exactly what worries Israel, because if Iran first receives maritime and economic relief, and only later the parties discuss the nuclear program, the missiles, and Hezbollah and Hamas and the proxies, Tehran can use the time to reorganize. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian published his first message after the answer was submitted. He said that Iran will never surrender to the enemy, and according to him, the very talk about dialogue does not mean surrender, but an attempt to secure the rights of the Iranian people and defend the national interest. This is very precise language. Iran wants to stay in the talks, but not appear weak. It wants again to gain time, but not admit that it is under pressure. It wants an agreement if that agreement is serving it, but not an agreement that dismantles its power levers. Trump, on his side, he responded with anger. He wrote that Iran has been playing games with the United States for 47 years, delaying, buying time, laughing at America. He added, they will not laugh any longer. And in another interview, Trump spoke about the enriched uranium that is still inside Iran. He said that the United States is monitoring it closely, including through the American Space Force. His message was sharp. If anyone gets near the materials, the Americans will know and will respond. Prime Minister Netanyahu said similar things. According to him, the war with Iran achieved a real great deal, but it is not over. There is still enriched uranium that needs to be removed from Iran. There are still enriched facilities that need to be dismantled. There are still Iranian proxies and ballistic missiles that need to be dealt with. Here's the gap between Jerusalem and Washington. In the United States, they want to stop the fire and manage the crisis. In Israel, we want to make sure that Iran does not come out of the war with nuclear capabilities, ballistic missiles, and regional proxies that can recover. In discussions in Israel, the IDF and the Mossad presented a more aggressive position. The assessment is that the Revolutionary Guards are a wounded organization right now. There are those who say that this moment must be used, action must be renewed, and the job must be finished. But the Israeli political leadership is cautious. In Jerusalem, they do not want to look as if they're dragging Trump into a war. They want to let him manage the American move while keeping the military option open. So, before we continue, if you understand the importance of what's happening here, what's happening in the Middle East, make sure to click the subscribe button, share this video, and also leave a comment. Let me know where you're watching from, because these updates of boots on the ground are built to bring you the reality of what's happening here from the field without the unnecessary noise and without filters. The more you share, the more people can understand what stands behind the headlines and what is happening here. The diplomatic access does not pass only through Pakistan, because Qatar has become a much more central player in recent days. The Prime Minister of Qatar, Mohammed bin Abdullah Rahman Al Thani, met in Miami with the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. A day earlier, he met with Vice President J.D. Vance in Washington. At first, Qatar tried to stay behind the scenes, not to take credit, not to appear too close to Iran, but now Doha is already appearing openly inside the move. It holds an open channel to Washington and to Tehran, and this is trying to position itself as a mediator that cannot be bypassed. There is also a price for that, because Qatar itself was affected by the regional tension, but compared to other Gulf states, it managed to preserve room for maneuvers. And according to some estimates, Tehran was more careful with Qatar than with the other neighbors, exactly because of this situation. They want to preserve them as a channel for communications. A Qatari gas tanker moving towards Pakistan through the Hormuz area also enters the picture now, because in Iran, they see such a passage as a confidence-building step towards Qatar and Pakistan, and the tanker passes. It will be a small but very important sign. Even inside the confrontation, there are routes that all sides are trying to keep open. So the United Arab Emirates is on the other side of all of this equation, because Tehran threatened it because of its ties to Israel and to the United States. But Abu Dhabi did not move away from Jerusalem. On the contrary, according to the reports, after the Iranian attacks on the Emiratis, Israel even assisted with air defensive systems, including the deployment of the Iron Dome batteries on the country's territory. The Emiratis has suffered many attacks since this war began from Iran. Energy facilities, airports, and civilian infrastructure was harmed. They entered the circle of threat. What was once a civilian and an economic relationship with Israel has now become a more visible security alliance, and Iran tried to intimidate Abu Dhabi, and Israel responded. The result was a tighter bond between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and the United States. And at the same time, Britain is sending a destroyer, HMS Dragon, to the area. The stated mission of this destroyer, this operation, is for the possibility of a multinational force led by Britain and France that will secure shipping in the Strait of Hormuz when the conditions allow it. The Iranians are already warning that any such deployment will receive an immediate response. And here too, we see the gap. Europe says defensive missions. Iran says hostile intervention. And between these two definitions are commercial ships that simply need to move from one side of the Gulf to the other. And meanwhile, inside Iran itself, the picture is not stable. Iran's news, the news agency reported a powerful explosion in the port city of Chabahar. This is in the southwest of the country. Later, it was said that this was a controlled explosion of unexploded ammunition, but the location itself is important. Chabahar is a strategic port with direct access to the Indian Ocean. It is one of Iran's most important maritime assets outside the Persian Gulf. Any explosion in such a place creates alertness. This is especially when Hormuz is under threat and the regime is looking for backup routes, alternative trade routes and links, and a way to show that it still controls the maritime arenas. And at the same time, Mustafa Khamenei is trying to project control, and that he's alive, by the way. According to Iranian reports, he met with the commander of Qatar al-Anbiya headquarters, Ali Abdullah Khani, and received a briefing from him on the readiness of the forces, on the army, on the Revolutionary Guards, on the besieged forces, and whatever the Ministry of Defense is preparing. And afterwards, it was reported that Khamenei gave new instructions for continued operations. This is a double message. Outwardly, we are talking to the Americans. Inwardly, the leader is in control. The military is ready, and the campaign is not over. But around Khamenei, there are still questions. He has not been seen in public since he was wounded in the opening strike of this operation, Roaring Lion. His medical condition and the isolation makes it difficult to understand who is actually making the decisions in Tehran. And that's critical, because if the leader is isolated, and if the Revolutionary Guards and the hardline factions are each pulling in different directions, then negotiations with Iran become even more dangerous. It is not always clear whether the person speaking on behalf of Iran can really bind Iran, because hardline factions inside the regime are already trying to sabotage any possible agreement, and they are attacking the negotiating teams. They're accusing the senior officials of surrender, and they're demanding that tougher line against the United States will be taken. Resistance to Washington and Israel is not a tactic, it is an ideology. And that explains the Iranian behavior. On the one hand, they need an agreement. On the other hand, they cannot appear as if they are surrendering. That's why they answer late. That is why they talk about 30 days. That is why they demand first the end of this war and the opening of Hormuz, and only afterwards the discussion of the other arenas. China is also entering the background here because Trump is expected to arrive in Beijing this week for a meeting with Xi Jinping. From the White House's perspective, ending or at least freezing the war with Iran before this meeting could be a strengthening of Trump's position. From China's perspective, the Hormuz crisis is both a threat and an opportunity. A large part of the oil that is imported into China passes through Hormuz, but Beijing, they prepared for such a scenario for years. This is with strategic oil reserves, land pipelines from Russia and Central Asia, and investments in alternative energy routes. While other countries are under pressure, China is trying to present itself as a measured player. And that means that Trump arrives in China with Iran still on the table. He will need to talk with Xi about trade, Taiwan, critical minerals, technology, and also the question of whether China will pressure Tehran or use the crisis to weaken America's standing in the Middle East. This war began around the Iranian nuclear program, but it has long since stopped being only about the nuclear program. It's about Hormuz, about Hezbollah, about the Gulf states, about China, about prices of gas, about American credibility, and about Israel's ability to make sure that Iran does not rise again stronger after this ceasefire. And that brings us to Lebanon, because Tehran is asking for the arrangement to focus also on ending the war on all fronts, especially in Lebanon. That's not accidental. Hezbollah is Iran's central strategic assets on Israel's border. If Iran succeeds in bringing Lebanon into the deal, it will try to preserve Hezbollah, or at least prevent Israel from having full freedom of action against it. In Israel, we understand this. That's why Jerusalem is concerned about an American agreement that does not seriously address the missiles, the nuclear program, and the proxies. Such an agreement could freeze the war, but not solve the threat. If Hezbollah remains armed, if Iran keeps enriched uranium, if the Revolutionary Guards restore the missiles and drones, then the world may receive temporarily quiet, but Israel will receive a threat that returns later. There are three possibilities on the table: a partial agreement, which buys time but leaves difficult questions open, a continued limited confrontation with no decision and no real agreement, or a return to a broad war with the risk of regional escalation and damage to the global economy. None of the options is simple, but one thing is clear: Iran is trying to prove that it has not been broken. The United States is trying to show that it is not being dragged, and Israel is trying to make sure that the campaign does not end before the real threat has been handled. Tonight, the Middle East looks quiet only from far away. Up close, every layer is moving. Ships on the Gulf, drones over the Emiratis and also Qatar, contacts through Pakistan and Qatar, American pressure, Israeli concern, and an Iranian leadership that talks about an agreement and prepares the military. This war is no longer measured only by the number of strikes, but by the question of who will wear down first: the Iranian regime, the American patience, or the world's ability to live with the Strait of Hormuz under threat. And if Iran truly wants an agreement, why does it keep threatening ships, bases, Gulf states, and underwater communication cables? Let me know in the comments. In the meantime, keep spreading the truth. Share this video with as many people as possible, and the best thing that you could do is to unite in prayer for the situation, for the people that are affected, for the leaders to be wise, for the children, for the next generation, and for the peace of Jerusalem. We'll see you again later.